we have to eat, and the only proteins are the dead bodies of the people that were on display. I said, you know, everybody's thinking the same thing.
Cannibalism might sound like something out of a scary movie, but it's true, and it happens. Yep, you heard that right. Today, I am going to take you guys into some seriously twisted stories that'll have you questioning everything you thought you knew about humanity. Number 1. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer's name is like an echo that can even make the dead run for their life. He was responsible for the murders of 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. His crimes involved cannibalism and necrophilia. Dahmer's era began in 1978 with the murder of an 18-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. After luring Hicks to his home, Dahmer killed him, dismembered his body, and buried the remains behind his parents' residence. Over the following years, Dahmer took the lives of 12 additional victims, many of whom were marginalized individuals, often impoverished and from racial minorities. He would attract them to his home, where he drugged and strangled them before committing unimaginable acts on their lifeless bodies, sometimes retaining body parts as grisly mementos. What made Dahmer's crimes particularly heinous was his disturbing practice of cannibalism. Evidence suggested that he had cooked and consumed the flesh of some of his victims, earning him chilling nicknames like the Milwaukee Cannibal and the Milwaukee Monster. In 1991, his crimes came to a halt with his arrest and subsequent conviction for 15 of the murders. He received 15 consecutive life sentences, but his time behind bars was brief. In 1994, Dahmer met a violent end himself, murdered by a fellow inmate in prison. Number 2. The Revolutionary United Front. The Revolutionary United Front, RUF, was a group in Sierra Leone, Africa, back in the late 1990s. They were on a mission to take down the government, and they did some terrible things along the way. They wanted control of the diamond mines because those diamonds could bring them lots of money for their operations. With the help of some people from Liberia, led by Charles Taylor, the RUF did some awful stuff. They made kids into soldiers, cut off people's arms and legs, and even did cannibalism, eating the flesh of their enemies. It was all about scaring people and showing off their power. The RUF didn't just use physical violence, they messed with people's heads too. They wanted to break the spirit of the people and make them turn against the government. It was a really chaotic time, so it's hard to know exactly how many people suffered because of them. The rest of the world couldn't ignore what was happening, so the United Nations stepped in. They set up a special court to punish those who committed war crimes. Even though it's been a while since then, Sierra Leone is still dealing with the aftermath of what the RUF did. Healing those wounds takes a long time. Number 3. Issei Sagawa. Issei Sagawa, a student from Japan, made headlines around the world for a shocking crime he committed while studying in Paris. It was June 11th, 1981, when Sagawa met Renée Hartevelt, a fellow student from the Netherlands. He lured her to his apartment, pretending they would work on a project together. But instead, he shot and killed her. Then, over the next couple of days, he did something truly horrifying. He ate parts of her body. The French police caught Sagawa, but they said he was too mentally unstable to stand trial. So, instead of facing justice in France, he was sent back to Japan. But here's where things went terribly wrong. Because of a mistake in the paperwork, Sagawa was released from a mental institution after just over a year. That meant he got away without any real punishment for what he did. After this, Issei Sagawa lived freely in Japan, which understandably made a lot of people angry and shocked. However, this fear finally ended when he died in November 2022 in Tokyo. His case shows how messed up things can get when bureaucracy and legal systems fail. Number 4. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei Chikatilo, originally from Ukraine, became one of the most feared serial killers and rapists in the Soviet Union. He confessed to committing more than 50 horrifying murders and mutilations, where he not only killed, but also cannibalized his victims. His motive was solely for his own sick pleasure, making his crimes even more terrifying. Chikatilo started his terrifying spree in the late 1970s and kept at it throughout the 1980s. He targeted people of all ages, from little kids to grown women. The Soviet cops and courts didn't do a great job, letting him slip through the cracks for way too long. But finally, in 1990, they nabbed him, putting an end to one of the biggest manhunts in Russian history. His crimes were so brutal and widespread that they sent shockwaves throughout the whole country, spreading fear like wildfire. When Chikatilo got busted and confessed, it revealed the full horror of what he'd done, including some seriously messed up stuff like cannibalism. It gave us a chilling glimpse into the mind of a serial killer, showing just how twisted his reasons were. After a lengthy trial, Chikatilo was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was executed in Rostov on February 14, 1994. Number 5. Alfred Packer. Alfred Packer was a gold prospector from America who got into serious trouble back in 1874. He went on an expedition with 5 other people into the Colorado mountains, but when he came back alone after 2 months, people got suspicious. They asked him what happened to the others. Packer said he had to defend himself against them and ended up eating their bodies to survive. But people didn't buy his story. They thought something fishy was going on. Eventually, Packer confessed to killing his companions. During his trial, it was found out that he tricked the group into following him, pretending he knew the way. But when things got tough, he couldn't handle it, and he turned on them. Packer got convicted of manslaughter and got a huge 40-year sentence, the longest ever at that time. But even after the trial, people still weren't sure if he did it out of greed or just to survive. Surprisingly, in 1901, Packer was released on parole because some doubts remained about his guilt. Some people say that maybe he did some bad stuff, but the tough conditions might have messed with his head. You can't be that messed up, can you? After he got out, he lived a pretty quiet life, working odd jobs. He passed away in 1907, but his story still gives people chills when they talk about the wild days of the American frontier. Number 6. The Mauerova family. The Mauerova family was involved in a disturbing case of child abuse, cannibalism, and cult activity in the Czech Republic. Klara Mauerova and her sister Katerina Mauerova were part of a religious cult called the Grail Movement, along with Barbora Skalova. Klara had 2 sons, Andrei and Jakub, and the 3 women subjected the boys to horrific abuse. The boys were locked in a cage in the basement for a year, where they were starved, tortured, beaten, sexually assaulted, and forced to cut themselves. The women also burned the boys with cigarettes, gave them electric shocks, and forced them to eat their own vomit. Most shockingly, the women held the boys down and skinned their legs, then ate the raw flesh. They forced the boys to consume their own flesh as well. The abuse was uncovered when a neighbor's baby monitor picked up footage of the torture. Klara, Katerina, and Barbora were all arrested and convicted for their roles in the abuse. Klara received 9 years in prison, Katerina received 10 years, and Barbora received 5 years. They have since been paroled. The purpose of the abuse was apparently to break the boys and enslave them for the cult's religious purposes, as the women believed they were absolved from committing crimes. It was a truly horrific case of child abuse and cannibalism tied to a cult-like group. Even thinking about it makes my skin crawl. Number 7. Armin Meiwes. Armin Meiwes, also known as the Rotenburg Cannibal or the Master Butcher, became infamous for committing a heinous act of murder and cannibalism in 2001 that shocked the world. Born in 1961 in Essen, Germany, Meiwes' troubled upbringing and fascination with the macabre tale of Hansel and Gretel likely contributed to his descent into darkness. His loneliness only deepened after his father abandoned him at the age of 8, leaving him to grapple with disturbing desires. In 2001, at the age of 41, Meiwes placed a chilling advertisement online seeking a willing victim for his unthinkable desires. Bernd Jürgen Brandes, a 43-year-old man, responded to this disturbing call, leading to a gruesome rendezvous at Meiwes' home. What followed was a nightmarish sequence of events. After engaging in sexual acts, Brandes requested that Meiwes sever his own genitals, which Meiwes did before ultimately ending Brandis's life with a fatal stab to the neck. In the aftermath of the murder, Meiwes' descent into darkness continued as he consumed approximately 20 kilograms of Brandis' flesh over the ensuing months, a ghastly feast fueled by his darkest desires. Meiwes' crazy acts came to an end when a vigilant college student discovered his online solicitation for another victim, prompting swift action from authorities. In December 2002, Meiwes was apprehended and his horrifying crimes were brought to light. Initially convicted of manslaughter in 2004 and sentenced to 8.5 years in prison, Meiwes' case sparked intense legal debate. In a retrial in 2006, he was rightfully convicted of murder and received a life sentence, marking the end of his reign of terror. Meiwes' case also led to significant legal reforms, including the criminalization of cannibalism in Germany. Number 8. The Carib tribes. After Christopher Columbus's expedition to the West Indies, reports of cannibalism emerged, shocking Europeans and challenging their understanding of the world. For Europeans, cannibalism was seen as horrifying and sacrilegious, so witnessing Carib natives participating in post-war rituals involving human flesh was deeply unsettling. This encounter led to a major misunderstanding of Caribbean culture among Europeans, who quickly labeled the Carib natives as savages. Unfortunately, this perception had grave consequences, providing justification for the subjugation and exploitation of indigenous peoples across the Americas. The idea of native uncivilization fueled policies of slavery, mass killings, exploitation, and the deliberate erasure of indigenous cultures. These encounters show the cultural clash between Europeans and indigenous peoples in the Americas. The misunderstandings and dehumanization of native populations laid the groundwork for centuries of oppression and cultural devastation, leaving scars that continue to impact societies today. Number 9. Miracle of the Andes. On October 13, 1972, a plane from Uruguay carrying a rugby team and their supporters crashed in the Andes Mountains while going to Chile. Out of the people on board, only 16 survived. They were stuck on a glacier high up in the mountains, where it was very cold, and they didn't have much food. After 10 days, they ran out of food and had no choice but to eat the bodies of their friends who had died in the crash. This was really hard for them, but it kept them alive. For 72 days, they had to deal with freezing weather, snowstorms, and the fear of never being rescued. Two of the survivors, Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa, decided to walk through the dangerous mountains to find help. It took them 10 days, but they finally made it to a village in Chile and got help. The story of what happened became famous and has been written about in books like Alive by Piers Paul Read and Miracle in the Andes by Nando Parrado, one of the survivors. People see it as an amazing example of how humans can survive even in the toughest situations. Number 10. The Maori. The Maori people were the first people to live in New Zealand, arriving there a really long time ago, even before Europeans came. They had a rich culture that had been developing for many, many years. They had cool ways of organizing their society, made amazing things, and had strong beliefs about the world. But when there were fights between groups, sometimes the Maori would eat the bodies of their enemies as a way to get back at them and show that they were more powerful. In October 1809, a European ship called the Boyd was attacked by a group of Maori warriors. They were retaliating for the mistreatment of a chief's son by the crew of the ship. The attack was swift and brutal. Most of the 66 people on board were killed, and some were taken ashore to be eaten. A few lucky survivors managed to hide in the ship's mast. They spent a terrifying night watching as the Maori warriors ate their fellow shipmates. The gruesome scene lasted until the next morning, leaving the survivors deeply traumatized. This event, known as the Boyd Massacre, is one of the most well-known incidents from the early contact between Maori and Europeans in the 19th century. It highlights the clashes and misunderstandings that often led to violence during this time in New Zealand's history. Number 11. Vince Lee. In 2008, Vince Lee, also known as Will Baker, shocked Canada with a horrific act of violence aboard a Greyhound bus in Manitoba. He committed an unthinkable act, decapitating and consuming parts of a fellow passenger, leaving the entire nation in disbelief and leading to many discussions about mental illness, legal responsibility, and community safety. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, Lee was found not criminally responsible for his actions due to the severity of his mental illness. Instead of facing a traditional trial, he was placed in a psychiatric facility for intensive treatment and supervision. As his mental health improved over time, he was granted more privileges as part of his rehabilitation. In a controversial decision in 2021, the Manitoba Criminal Code Review Board granted Lee an absolute discharge, effectively releasing him from all supervision. Number 12. Boon Helm. Boon Helm, also known as the Kentucky Cannibal, was an American mountain man and serial killer whose actions in the 1850s are still remembered as a dark part of American history. Born in Kentucky in 1828, Helm grew up as a rough and wild person, often getting into fights and drinking heavily. His violent tendencies started early. At just 15 years old, he fatally stabbed a friend who refused to go with him to California. This shocking act got him sent to a mental institution because of his erratic behavior. But Helm escaped and made his way to California, where he continued to do terrible things, including killing people and even resorting to cannibalism to survive. In 1858, Helm got into a fight with Digger Indians, and one of his friends died. Stranded and desperate, Helm and another friend named Burton had to eat their horses to stay alive, earning Helm the nickname Kentucky Cannibal. Despite being caught by the law a few times, Helm always managed to escape punishment, hiding out for years while continuing his awful actions. Finally, in 1864, he was caught for good and was hanged along with 12 other criminals at Bannock Mines. Number 13. Antron Big Lurch Singleton. Antron Big Lurch Singleton, an American rapper, saw his life take a turn when he was convicted of a horrific crime. Born in Dallas, Texas in 1976, Singleton pursued a career in rap music from an early age, initially performing as G Spade before adopting the persona of Big Lurch due to his imposing 6 feet 7 inches stature. In September 2000, Singleton's life was drastically altered when he was involved in a car accident caused by a drunk driver, resulting in a broken neck. Following his discharge from the hospital, he turned to PCP to manage chronic pain. Tragically, in April 2002, while under the influence of PCP, Singleton allegedly murdered his roommate, Tinashe Sayes, in her Los Angeles apartment. Isaias was discovered with her chest ripped open, her right lung removed, and bearing bite marks on her face and lungs. Shortly after the gruesome discovery, Singleton was apprehended, found naked and drenched in blood. A medical examination revealed human flesh in his stomach that didn't belong to him. Despite advice from his lawyer and record label owner Milton Grimes to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, California law prevented this plea due to Singleton's voluntary ingestion of the substance that led to the crime. In June 2003, Singleton was convicted of first-degree murder, torture, and aggravated mayhem, earning 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. His own song lyrics, notably from I Did It to You, which referenced serial killers and cannibalism, were used as evidence against him during the trial. Singleton says he didn't do it and blames Grimes for making up the story because they were in rival gangs. He also says a hungry dog caused Isaias' death. He thinks Grimes didn't defend him well and worked with the prosecutors. Isaias' mom sued Singleton's record label, saying they gave him drugs that made him violent. Singleton is still in jail at California State Prison Corcoran, trying to get a new trial. His case shows how complicated it can be when mental illness, drugs, and who's responsible for a crime come into play in the legal system. Number 14. The Wari. The Wari people in Brazil have a special cultural tradition called endocannibalism. This means they ritually eat the bodies of their dead family members and friends. It's a big part of their culture, and it has different meanings. It's a way for them to show respect to the people who have passed away and to keep their memories alive. They also believe it helps them inherit the knowledge and wisdom of the ones who have died. Endocannibalism has been a long-standing tradition among the Wari, dating back to the early 20th century. It formed a main part of their funeral customs, believed to facilitate the transition of the soul to the afterlife. The process involved placing the deceased on racks to aid decomposition until reaching a stage called melorack. At this point, the body was trimmed, and the remains were stored in containers for further fermentation. Family members then separated the liquid and solid components, with the solids buried and the liquid consumed. Preparation and consumption were integral to the ritual. After several days of mourning, the body was removed from the rack and transferred to a container for additional fermentation. The liquid portion was consumed by family members, believed to assist the soul's journey and transfer the deceased's knowledge. Endocannibalism was really important to the Wari people because they saw it as a way to honor their loved ones who had passed away and help them move on peacefully to the afterlife. Number 15. Fore people of Papua. In the middle of the 20th century, the Fore people in Papua New Guinea faced a really serious health problem called kuru. It's a disease that damages the brain and is always fatal. This disease was closely linked to a cultural practice they had of eating the brains and nervous systems of their dead relatives as a way to show respect and sadness. At its worst in the late 1950s, kuru was killing up to 2% of the Fore population every year. Once they found out that this practice of eating brains was causing the disease, they stopped doing it right away. But because kuru takes a long time to show up after someone gets infected, there are still cases among the Fore today, mostly in people who were exposed to it when they were kids. Scientists have looked into the Fore's genes and found a special change in one of their genes called PRNP, specifically at a place called codon 127. This change makes them much less likely to get prion diseases like kuru. It's interesting because this change seems to protect them better than other changes in the same gene that are known to affect disease risk. It's thought that this change in the gene happened because of how bad the kuru epidemic was. People who have 2 copies of this gene change have a really low risk of getting the disease. Studying how the Fore are protected from kuru has given scientists important ideas about how prion diseases work and how they might be treated in the future. And with that was all for today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed hearing about these interesting stories, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more crazy content like this. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.